Ethan Carter had grown accustomed to fading into the background. At 17, he was a boy of gentle manners and soft words, though few ever cared to notice. His large frame and quiet demeanor made him an easy target for teasing. But he bore it with the kind of patience that comes not from strength but from resignation. The laughter and whispers followed him through the school halls, like an ever-present shadow. But he walked on, his gaze fixed downward, as though by looking away, he could will himself invisible. There was, however, one face he couldn't help but look toward. Chloe Brighton. She was everything Ethan wasn't. Confident, radiant, and adored by everyone. She carried herself with an ease that turned heads, her golden hair catching the light like a halo. To Ethan, she was more than just the most popular girl in school. She was a symbol of everything he thought he could never have: acceptance, belonging, and perhaps, if he dared dream, love. So when Chloe handed him an invitation to her party one afternoon, Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. She had smiled at him. A dazzling smile that seemed to hold no malice, no hint of the cruel jokes he was used to enduring. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe it was real. "Hope you can make it," she said lightly, pressing the small, glittering card into his hand. Her voice was sweet, casual, as though they'd been friends all along. Before he could respond, she was gone, her laughter trailing behind her as she rejoined her circle of friends. Ethan stared at the invitation, his heart hammering in his chest. The words felt unreal, written in delicate gold script against a glossy white background. "Join me this Saturday at 7 p.m. for an unforgettable night." Chloe's name was signed at the bottom, each loop of her signature a work of art. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was his chance. A break in the gray monotony of his life. Maybe Chloe saw something in him that others didn't. That thought alone was enough to send him spiraling into nervous excitement. He spent the next few days preparing. He rented a suit sleek and far more expensive than anything he owned and borrowed his uncle's car. A glossy sedan that gleamed under the sun. He even bought a bracelet for Chloe, using the little money he had saved from part-time work. It wasn't much, but he imagined her eyes lighting up when she saw it. Imagined her gratitude and warmth. On the night of the party, Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for the fourth time. His reflection looked back at him, tentative and unsure. He had never felt comfortable in his own skin. And now, dressed in clothes that didn't quite belong to him, he felt like an imposter. But he shook off the doubt. Tonight would be different. Driving to Chloe's house, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the neighborhood. The homes were large and pristine, their manicured lawns lit softly by elegant lanterns. Chloe's house stood at the end of the street, a grand two-story affair with music and laughter spilling from its open windows. Ethan hesitated before stepping out of the car. His palms were clammy, and he could feel his heart thudding in his chest. Gathering his courage, he grabbed the gift bag containing the bracelet and walked toward the house. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of perfume and cologne, mingling with the hum of conversation and the bass of the music. Ethan felt out of place immediately, but when he saw Chloe standing near the staircase, his nerves settled. She looked stunning in a flowing dress, her laughter ringing out above the music. For a moment, she was the only person in the room. "Ethan," she called out, waving him over. He smiled shyly, making his way through the crowd. When he reached her, he held out the gift bag. "This is for you," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the noise. Chloe took the bag, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Oh, how sweet," she said, loud enough for those around her to hear. Ethan's stomach fluttered at the sound of her approval. But then, something shifted. Chloe turned to the crowd, raising her voice. "Everyone, can I have your attention?" Ethan's breath caught. Was she going to thank him in front of everyone? Was this the moment everything changed? "It was all a bet," Chloe announced, her voice bright and playful. "We wanted to see if I could get Ethan to come to my party. And guess what? He actually showed up." The room erupted in laughter. The sound hit Ethan like a physical blow, sharp and unrelenting. He stood frozen, the smile still faintly lingering on his face as his brain struggled to catch up. Chloe's real boyfriend, a tall, muscular boy with a smirk that never left his face, stepped forward. Did you really think you had a chance, Carter? He sneered. Look at you. The laughter grew louder, each note piercing Ethan's already fragile confidence. His vision blurred as heat rose to his face, clutching his hands into fists. He turned and walked out, the sound of their laughter chasing him into the night. Outside, the air was cool, but it did little to soothe the fire burning in his chest. Ethan climbed into his car and gripped the steering wheel. His knuckles white. He felt hollow, like a shell of himself. His hopes and dreams shattered in an instant. As he sat there, staring out at the darkened street, something new began to take root. It wasn't sadness or despair, it was anger. Quiet and simmering, it spread through him like a slow-burning flame. Ethan Carter had always accepted his place at the bottom. But tonight, he whispered to himself, no more. The flame burned brighter. The days that followed the party were marked by silence. Ethan Carter stayed in his room, the blinds drawn and his phone switched off. His world had become a smaller, darker place, as if his shame had cast a shadow over everything. He didn't dare look at his messages or social media, knowing what awaited him. The memory of their laughter still echoed in his mind, cruel and unending, and the thought of facing it all again was unbearable. When he finally ventured online, it was worse than he imagined. Videos of the party had spread like wildfire, clips of Chloe's declaration, the crowd's laughter, and Ethan's retreat into the night. The comments were relentless. Some were mocking, others cruelly creative, but all of them seemed to converge on one message: Ethan Carter was a joke. He stared at the screen, his chest tight and his face hot with shame. He had endured mockery before, but this felt different. This was public, sprawling, and inescapable. Every part of his life, from the hallways of the school to the anonymous sprawl of the internet, seemed united in making him feel small. He closed his laptop and pushed it away. But the damage was already done. For 2 weeks, Ethan avoided school. He avoided everything. His mother knocked on his door each morning, her voice soft and worried. But he would only mutter excuses about feeling sick. She didn't press him, though he could sense her growing concern. Even his few friends reached out, their messages kind but tentative, as though they weren't quite sure how to handle the weight of his humiliation. Ethan couldn't bring himself to reply. Instead, he sat with his thoughts, letting them swirl and grow. The pain of rejection, the shame of being exposed, and the simmering anger that lay beneath it all, they churned together in an endless cycle. And at the center of it was Chloe. Her radiant smile and cruel words seared into his memory. It wasn't just Chloe, though. It was the laughter, the ease with which everyone had joined in. They hadn't thought twice about how much it might hurt, how it might feel to be on the receiving end of their jeers. Ethan wasn't just angry at her, he was angry at all of them. At the unfairness of it. At the casual cruelty that people wielded so thoughtlessly, as though it were a game. But even in his anger, Ethan couldn't entirely push aside the doubt. Was it his fault? Had he been foolish to believe, even for a moment, that Chloe might have been sincere? That someone like her, someone who moved through the world with effortless grace and confidence, might see anything worth noticing in him? The thought stung, but he couldn't shake it. When he finally returned to school, it was with a sense of dread so heavy it felt like a physical weight. He had hoped, naively, that time might have dulled the sting of the party, that people might have moved on. But as soon as he walked into the classroom, the laughter erupted again. It was louder than ever, echoing off the walls like a cruel symphony. Chloe's laugh rang out above the rest, sharp and unapologetic, as though the memory of her triumph was still fresh. Ethan kept his head down, his face burning, and made his way to his desk. He thought if he stayed quiet enough, still enough, they might lose interest. But the whispers and snickers continued, punctuated by the occasional outright taunt. "Hey, Ethan," one boy called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You planning on bringing another gift to the queen?" More laughter followed. Ethan clenched his fists under the desk, his nails digging into his palms. He focused on his breathing, willing himself not to react, not to give them the satisfaction. It was then that a voice cut through the noise, a voice he didn't expect. "Leave him alone." The classroom fell silent, the laughter fading into a tense quiet. All eyes turned to the back of the room, where Isabel Harper stood, her small frame stiff with defiance. Isabel wasn't the kind of person people noticed often. She was quiet and unassuming. The daughter of a housekeeper, attending the school on a scholarship. But there was a firmness in her voice now that made even Chloe pause. "What's your problem?" Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly but steady. "Don't you have anything better to do than tear someone down?" Chloe's expression twisted, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Oh, please," she said, her tone dismissive. "What's it to you? Just mind your own business." But Isabel didn't back down. She stepped forward, her gaze steady. "Maybe someone should mind your business," she said, her voice calm but pointed. "It must take a lot of effort to keep up with all that cruelty." A murmur ran through the room, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't outright rebellion, but there was a crack in the veneer of Chloe's dominance. For a moment, she looked unsure, her confident mask slipping. "Watch it," Chloe snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "Don't forget where you come from." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Isabel's face reddened, but she didn't look away. "I haven't forgotten," she said quietly, "but maybe you should think about where you're headed." The tension in the room was palpable. Chloe opened her mouth to retort but seemed to think better of it. With a scoff, she turned away, and the spell was broken. The laughter didn't resume. The room was quiet now, the students exchanging uncertain glances. Ethan watched from his desk, his chest tight with an unfamiliar emotion. Gratitude, embarrassment, guilt. He wasn't sure how to feel. But he knew one thing. Isabel had done something no one else had. She had stood up for him. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Ethan hesitated. As the other students filed out, he approached Isabel. She was gathering her books, her expression unreadable. He cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "Thank you," he said softly. She looked up, surprised, and then gave him a small smile. "Don't mention it." But Ethan couldn't let it go. "I mean it," he said. "No one's ever done that for me before." Isabel shrugged, her gaze dropping. "I just couldn't stand it," she said simply. "What they did to you, it wasn't right." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to say more, to find the words to express what her kindness had meant to him. But for now, all he could do was hold on to the moment, fragile and rare as it was. As they walked out of the classroom together, the faintest glimmer of something new began to grow within Ethan. It wasn't hope, exactly, but it was close. The days following Isabel's quiet act of defiance passed uneventfully. But something had shifted. Ethan still carried the weight of humiliation, but it no longer felt as isolating. He now had someone to walk with between classes. Someone who didn't look away or laugh when others did. Isabel Harper had taken a small step toward him. And he, unsure but grateful, had stepped toward her in return. It began simply. A shared lunch table. A few hesitant words exchanged over sandwiches and apples. Ethan wasn't used to talking much, and Isabel didn't seem inclined to fill the silences with empty chatter. They spoke when there was something to say and sat quietly when there wasn't. A rhythm that suited them both. Isabel, Ethan learned, was more observant than she let on. She noticed things: how his hands fidgeted when he was nervous, how his eyes darted to the floor when someone walked by. She had her own way of dealing with the stares and whispers. A quiet resilience that Ethan couldn't help but admire. "You get used to it," she said one afternoon, her voice calm, almost detached. They were sitting on a bench outside the school, the autumn air cool against their skin. People staring, making assumptions. "It doesn't bother me as much anymore." Ethan frowned, unsure how to respond. He wanted to ask why she put up with it, why she didn't push back harder. But he thought of how she had stood up for him, how she had endured Chloe's sharp words without flinching. Maybe this was her way of pushing back, not with anger, but with quiet defiance. "Doesn't it make you angry?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabel tilted her head, considering his question. "It used to," she admitted, "but anger doesn't change anything. It just makes you tired." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure he agreed. Anger was all he had felt anger at Chloe, at the other students, at himself. It burned inside him, restless and unyielding. He wondered how Isabel had managed to let hers go. Or if she had simply buried it deeper. As their friendship grew, Ethan began to notice more about Isabel's life. She didn't talk much about herself. But bits and pieces emerged. Her mother worked as a housekeeper for the Brighton's Chloe's family. It was how Isabel had ended up at this school. A scholarship granted through connections she didn't ask for but couldn't refuse. It's not as glamorous as it sounds, Isabel said one day, her tone dry. I go to the same school as Chloe. But that's where the similarities end. I know exactly where I stand. Ethan didn't press her for details. But he could imagine. The Brightons lived in a sprawling house on the best street in town. Their wealth on full display in every meticulously trimmed hedge and polished window. Isabel's home, he suspected, was a world apart. One afternoon, as they walked home together, Ethan saw it for himself. They had passed the grand homes of the neighborhood, their conversations winding through small, unimportant topics. When they reached Chloe's house, Isabel paused, her shoulders stiffening. I have to go in here, she said, gesturing toward the house. Ethan frowned, confused. Why? My mom's working late, Isabel explained. I help her with the chores when school's over. It saves time. Ethan stared at her, his chest tightening. He had known, abstractly, that Isabel's mother worked for the Brightons. But seeing her walk up the driveway made it real in a way he hadn't anticipated. As Isabel disappeared inside, Ethan lingered on the sidewalk, his mind swirling with unease. The house looked different now, its grandeur tainted by what he knew of its inhabitants. Chloe's laughter still rang in his ears, sharp and cruel. How could someone who lived in so much comfort treat others with such disdain? Later that evening, Isabel texted him. Sorry I couldn't walk with you the rest of the way. Thanks for waiting. Ethan stared at the message for a long time before replying. No problem. Are you okay? She didn't answer for a while. And when she did, her response was simple. I'm used to it. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The next day, Ethan found himself waiting for Isabel outside the school. When she arrived, her eyes looked tired but warm. And she smiled faintly as she joined him. Did Chloe say something? Ethan asked, his tone cautious. Isabel shook her head. Not directly, but she doesn't have to. It's the way she looks at people. Like we're beneath her. Ethan clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest again. He wanted to say something. To promise that he'd do something to make Chloe pay for what she'd done, and not just to him, but to Isabel and her mother. But he knew words weren't enough. Instead, he said quietly, you shouldn't have to deal with that. Isabel shrugged. Maybe not. But we don't get to choose the cards we're dealt. For the first time, Ethan wondered if Isabel's strength came from necessity rather than choice. She didn't fight because she wanted to. She endured because she had no other option. It was a quiet, powerful kind of resilience, and it made Ethan question his own anger. What was he doing with it? What was it doing to him? As they walked, Isabel changed the subject, asking about Ethan's weekend plans. Their conversation drifted back to safer, lighter topics, but the weight of what they didn't say lingered in the air between them. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change. But for now, he walked beside Isabel, grateful for her presence, even as the questions in his mind remained unanswered. Ethan Carter had never considered himself a vengeful person. For most of his life, he had simply absorbed the blows, whether they were words or the sharp-edged stares of those who found him easy to ridicule. It was easier that way, less confrontational, but something had shifted since the night of Chloe Brighton's party. The humiliation had left a mark that didn't fade, and with it came a gnawing need to do something, not to restore his pride, but to remind himself he still mattered. He didn't share these thoughts with Isabel. Their conversations remained rooted in the mundane homework, school gossip, or the occasional joke about their shared awkwardness. Isabel had her own burdens, and Ethan didn't want to add his. She carried herself with a quiet strength, enduring the slights and dismissive comments from Chloe and her circle with a calm resolve that Ethan couldn't quite understand. One afternoon, as they sat under the large oak tree behind the school, Isabel told him about her mother's work. The details were sparse but enough to paint a picture. Long hours, little pay, and an endless stream of indignities disguised as casual remarks. Chloe's mother, Mrs. Brighton, was polite enough when others were around but sharp and curt when alone with Isabel's mother. They think being polite is enough, Isabel said, her tone measured, as if not yelling at someone makes them good people. Ethan nodded, understanding more than he wished he did. He had felt the same sting in the way Chloe and others treated him, not with overt malice but with the kind of casual disregard that came from seeing someone as less than human. Do you ever? Ethan hesitated, unsure how to frame his question. Do you ever want to call them out? Make them see what they're doing? Isabel looked at him, her expression thoughtful. Sometimes. But what's the point? They don't see it because they don't have to. Their world doesn't make room for people like us. Her words lingered with Ethan long after they parted ways that evening. He thought about Chloe's world, its glittering surfaces and unspoken hierarchies. She didn't see him. Not really. He was a means to an end. A pawn in her game of popularity and ego. But what if, just for once, he could turn the board? Blank. Blank. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Ethan had always known his cousin Ryan was a rising star in the local music scene. But it wasn't until he visited Ryan's studio one weekend that he saw just how much attention Ryan was getting. As they hung out, Ryan's phone buzzed with notifications, messages from fans, offers for gigs, and endless streams of admiration. One message stood out. Hi Ryan, I'm Chloe, big fan of your music. Hope you see this. Ethan froze, staring at the screen. Chloe's name felt like a slap, a reminder of everything she had taken from him. But as Ryan brushed off the message, uninterested, an idea began to form in Ethan's mind. Can I reply to her? Ethan asked, his voice casual. Ryan raised an eyebrow but handed over the phone. Go ahead. Not like I've got time for every fan. Ethan typed carefully, crafting a response that was just vague enough to keep Chloe intrigued. He provided a fake contact number, one that linked directly to a new account Ethan had set up under Ryan's name. Within minutes, Chloe was messaging Ryan, her tone dripping with admiration. She gushed about his music, her words surprisingly warm and sincere. For a moment, Ethan felt a pang of guilt. But then he remembered the party, the laughter, the cruel bet that had shattered his confidence. No, he thought, she deserves this. Blank. Over the next few days, Chloe's messages grew more frequent, more effusive. She told Ryan about her life, her love for music, and her excitement about the upcoming school prom. Ethan played along, responding just enough to keep her interested. He knew he was walking a fine line. But the more he interacted with her, the more he saw another side of Chloe, not kinder. Exactly, but more insecure than he had imagined. Chloe spoke often of the prom, her words tinged with an eagerness that bordered on desperation. She wanted it to be perfect, the crowning moment of her high school life. She hinted that having Ryan as her date would make it unforgettable. Ethan decided to give her what she wanted, just not in the way she expected. Blank. Isabel noticed Ethan's distracted demeanor but didn't press him. Instead, she focused on their shared routines, helping him stick to the workouts she had introduced to boost his confidence. Ethan had thrown himself into the effort, not just to change how others saw him, but to change how he saw himself. The results were subtle but undeniable. His clothes fit better, his posture had improved, and there was a newfound steadiness in his gaze. You look different, Isabel said one day, her tone light but sincere. Ethan smiled, the compliment warming him more than he expected. Thanks. I feel different. Their friendship had deepened in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. Isabel's quiet encouragement had become a lifeline, a counterbalance to the anger and hurt that still lingered. She didn't ask about Chloe, though Ethan suspected she knew something was brewing. As the prom approached, Chloe's excitement became palpable. Ethan, still posing as Ryan, promised to meet her there, leaving her to imagine the grand entrance they would make together. But he had no intention of fulfilling her fantasy. Instead, he planned a reveal that would turn the spotlight back on Chloe, forcing her to confront the image she had so carefully cultivated. Ethan wasn't sure what he expected to feel as the plan took shape. Satisfaction? Revenge? But as the days passed, he found himself thinking less about Chloe and more about Isabel. Her resilience, her kindness, her quiet strength, they had become his anchor. His reminder of what truly mattered. By the time prom night arrived, Ethan wasn't seeking revenge anymore. He was seeking something else entirely, a way to reclaim his dignity. Not through cruelty, but through the quiet, unyielding assertion of his worth. He hoped, in the end, it would be enough. Prom night descended quietly over the town. Its significance marked by the glow of string lights wrapped around the school's front entrance and the faint hum of music spilling into the cool evening air. Inside the hall, students milled about in glittering dresses and sharp suits, their laughter and chatter filling the space with an electric energy. Ethan Carter stood outside, his reflection dimly visible in the car window. The suit Isabel had helped him pick out fit perfectly now. A quiet testament to the months of effort he had poured into reshaping not just his body but his confidence. He adjusted his tie, his fingers steady, and turned to Isabel, who waited patiently beside him. "You ready?" she asked. Her voice gentle but firm, like it always was when she sensed his nerves. Ethan looked at her, momentarily stunned. Her dress was simple but elegant, the deep blue fabric complementing her dark, glossy hair. She carried herself with the same quiet grace she always did. Unpretentious but undeniable. For a moment, he forgot about Chloe, about the plan, about everything but how grateful he was that Isabel was here with him. "Yeah," he said softly, "I'm ready. Blank. Underscore. Blank." Inside, the prom was in full swing. The hall had been transformed into a wonderland of twinkling lights and flowing drapes. The air thick with the excitement of a night meant to be unforgettable. Chloe Brighton stood near the center of the room, a vision of glamour in her shimmering gown. She was radiant, but her eyes darted nervously to the door every few seconds. Her classmates noticed, exchanging whispers and curious glances. Chloe, who always commanded the room with effortless confidence, seemed unusually distracted tonight. Everyone knew she had broken up with her boyfriend days before the prom, fueling rumors that her date was someone extraordinary. She had let the whispers swirl, never confirming or denying them. But the anticipation was palpable. "Where is he?" one of her friends asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. "He'll be here," Chloe replied, her tone clipped but certain. "He's just running late." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her voice. Ethan, watching from a distance, saw the flicker of uncertainty in her expression. He had been watching her for a few minutes now. Unnoticed, blending into the crowd, Isabel stood beside him, her presence a steadying force. "You don't have to do this," Isabel said quietly. Her gaze wasn't judgmental, only thoughtful. Ethan shook his head. "It's not just about her. It's about me." Isabel nodded, understanding. She didn't press him further. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Chloe's moment came when the music paused, and the crowd's attention turned to the entrance. A figure appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the lights outside. The room buzzed with whispers and gasps as the figure stepped forward, revealing a strikingly tall man dressed in a long coat and a mask that obscured his face. It was Ethan's stand-in, a homeless man he had paid to play the part. The man walked with an exaggerated swagger, stopping just short of Chloe, who looked at him with a mix of awe and confusion. "Ryan?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The man said nothing, only reached for his mask. The room held its breath, the tension thick. When the mask came off, revealing a face weathered by time and hardship, the silence shattered into laughter. Chloe froze, her cheeks burning as the laughter rippled through the crowd. Her carefully constructed image, her night of triumph, was crumbling around her. She turned on her heel, pushing through the crowd, her steps hurried and unsteady. Ethan watched her go, his expression unreadable. He felt no joy, no satisfaction in her humiliation. Instead, there was a hollow ache, a sense of something unresolved. He turned to Isabel, who was watching him closely. "It's done," he said quietly. "Is it?" she asked, her tone soft but pointed. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ethan and Isabel danced once. their movements awkward but sincere. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a glimmer of lightness, as though the weight he had been carrying had shifted, if not lifted entirely. When the prom ended, they walked together to the car, the night air cool against their skin. Ethan glanced at Isabel, her face calm and thoughtful as always. "Do you think she'll be okay?" he asked. Isabel raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. "Does it matter?" Ethan hesitated. "Maybe it does." She studied him for a moment before responding. "Then maybe that's something you need to figure out." As they drove home, the quiet between them was comfortable but charged. Ethan knew Isabel was right. The plan had played out as he intended. But the resolution he sought still felt just out of reach. He wasn't sure what he expected to feel. But this quiet, lingering doubt wasn't it. The streets passed by in a blur of shadows and streetlights. And Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over yet. Not for Chloe, and not for him. The morning after prom, the town seemed quieter than usual. As if it, too, was catching its breath from the night's events. Ethan Carter woke up to the soft light filtering through his curtains. The air in his room still and heavy. For the first time in weeks. There were no messages waiting for him on his phone, no ridicule. No reminders of his lowest moment. The silence was welcome, but it felt strange, almost foreign. Prom night had gone as planned. But the satisfaction he had imagined was nowhere to be found. Instead, Ethan felt a lingering hollowness. As though he had been left holding the pieces of a puzzle he no longer wanted to solve. He thought of Chloe, her face when the mask came off. The way she had stumbled out of the hall with the weight of the crowd's laughter pressing down on her. The memory didn't bring him the closure he had hoped for. It only stirred an unease he couldn't quite name. Blank. Blank. Chloe Brighton spent that same morning in her room. The curtains drawn tight against the sunlight. Her dress from the night before lay crumpled on the floor. Its once glittering fabric now dull and lifeless in the shadows. She hadn't slept. The humiliation of prom replayed in her mind over and over. Each detail sharper than the last. The messages on her phone were relentless, her so-called friends laughing behind her back. The students she had once ruled over gleefully sharing videos of her downfall. Even her ex-boyfriend had joined in. His words dripping with a bitterness she hadn't expected. "Guess you're not as untouchable as you thought." The words stung more than she cared to admit. Chloe had built her life around being admired, envied, and feared. Now, all of it felt as though it had been stripped away in a single night. She tried to push the thoughts aside. But they lingered, heavy and suffocating. Blank. Ethan avoided Isabel that day. Unsure of what to say to her. He spent the afternoon walking through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. His thoughts scattered. His feet eventually carried him to the edge of Chloe's street, where her family's house loomed large and pristine against the backdrop of an overcast sky. It was there that he saw her. Chloe sat on the front steps. Her posture slumped in a way that felt entirely uncharacteristic. She didn't notice him at first. Her gaze fixed on the ground. For a moment, Ethan considered walking away. What could he possibly say to her now? But something stopped him. A faint whisper of curiosity or perhaps guilt. "Chloe," he said, his voice hesitant but steady. She looked up sharply, her expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she straightened her posture. The faintest trace of her usual confidence creeping into her demeanor. "What do you want?" she asked. Her tone defensive. Ethan hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just wanted to see if you're okay." Chloe let out a sharp laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "Do I look okay to you?" Ethan didn't answer. He stood there awkwardly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, Chloe sighed, her shoulders sagging. "You must be pretty proud of yourself," she said bitterly. "You got your revenge. Everyone thinks I'm a joke now." Ethan shook his head. "It wasn't about that," he said quietly. "At least, not anymore." "Then what was it about?" Chloe demanded, her voice rising. "You humiliated me in front of the whole school. You made me feel..." She stopped, her voice breaking. "You made me feel like nothing." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Ethan felt a pang of regret, sharper than he expected. He thought of how he had felt after her party. The way her laughter had cut through him. It hadn't been right, but was what he had done any better? I just wanted you to understand, he said softly, what it feels like. Chloe stared at him for a long moment. Her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head. A bitter smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Is that what this is? A lesson? She said. Congratulations. You're no better than me. Her words stung. But Ethan didn't argue. Maybe she was right. Maybe he wasn't better. The thought lingered as he turned to leave, the weight of it settling uncomfortably in his chest. Blank. Blank. That evening, Isabel found Ethan sitting under the old oak tree behind the school. She approached quietly, her footsteps light against the grass. When she sat beside him, he didn't look up, but she could feel the tension in his posture. You saw her, Isabel said, her tone more statement than question. Ethan nodded. Yeah. And? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. She's not what I thought. Isabel tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. I thought if I embarrassed her, if I made her feel what I felt, it would fix things, he said, but it didn't. It just made everything messier. Isabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, hurt people. That's how it's always been. Ethan frowned, her words sinking in. Do you think I'm like her? No, Isabel said firmly, but I think you need to figure out what kind of person you want to be. They sat in silence after that, the faint rustle of leaves filling the space between them. Ethan felt the weight of Isabel's words, their truth pressing against him. The path he had taken had brought him here, but where it led next was still uncertain. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let his pain define him. He would find a way to move forward, to be better not just for himself, but for the people who believed in him. It was a small step, but it was a start. The days after prom passed slowly, the atmosphere at school subdued in the wake of the night's events. The usual rhythm of gossip and bravado seemed muted, as though a collective exhaustion had settled over the students. Ethan Carter moved through the hallways with a quiet resolve, his presence no longer attracting the same whispers and taunts it once had. But the silence wasn't entirely comforting. It felt tenuous, like the calm before a storm he couldn't quite predict. Chloe Brighton didn't return to school right away. Her absence was noted but not questioned. Even her closest friends seemed hesitant to speak her name. Ethan wondered where she had gone. If she was avoiding the world as he once had, or if she was plotting her own form of revenge. The thought unsettled him, not out of fear, but out of a strange, nagging guilt that he couldn't quite shake. Blank. Isabel Harper noticed the change in Ethan. Though she didn't comment on it, she had always been good at sensing when someone needed space. And Ethan appreciated her quiet understanding. They spent their afternoons under the oak tree, their conversations lighter now, more reflective, but the weight of unspoken thoughts lingered, an undercurrent in their otherwise easy companionship. Do you think people can change? Ethan asked one day, his voice breaking the stillness. Isabel looked up from the book she had been reading, her expression thoughtful. I think they can, she said slowly, but only if they really want to. And even then, it takes time. Ethan nodded, her words resonating with something deep inside him. Do you think she can? Isabel didn't need to ask who he meant. Chloe? Yeah. She closed her book, resting it on her lap. I don't know. People like her, they're used to the world bending for them. It's hard to change when you've never had to. Ethan frowned, considering this. But she's not who I thought she was. He said, when I saw her after prom, she wasn't just angry. She was hurt. Like really hurt. Isabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, sometimes, people hide their pain by hurting others. It doesn't make it right. But it's how they cope. The words hung in the air, their truth settling heavily between them. Ethan thought of all the times he had swallowed his own pain. The anger and shame that had built up inside him until it had spilled over. He had wanted Chloe to understand what it felt like to be humiliated. To be powerless. But now that she did, he wasn't sure it had been worth it. Blank. Chloe returned to school the following week. Her entrance was quiet, almost unremarkable, a stark contrast to the way she used to command attention. Her usual entourage seemed to keep their distance, their loyalty shaken by the cracks in her once flawless image. She walked the hallways with her head held high. But there was a fragility to her confidence now. A sense of someone trying to hold themselves together. Ethan watched her from afar, unsure if he should approach her or leave her be. Part of him felt that their story had reached its end, that whatever reckoning they had needed had already come and gone. But another part of him, part that had seen her vulnerability, however fleeting, felt that there was still something unresolved. It was during lunch that their paths finally crossed. Chloe was sitting alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria, her tray untouched. Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest, before walking over to her. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, his voice steady but quiet. Chloe looked up, her expression guarded. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a small shrug, she gestured to the empty chair across from her. Ethan sat down, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. "I didn't think you'd want to talk to me," Chloe said finally, her voice low. Ethan studied her, noting the tension in her posture, the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her tray. "I wasn't sure," he admitted, "but I thought maybe we should." Chloe let out a soft laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "What's there to say? You got what you wanted. Everyone hates me now." "I didn't want that," Ethan said firmly. "I wanted you to understand. That's all." Chloe looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. "And do you think I do?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "I think you're starting to." The words seemed to land heavily on her, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I didn't think about it," she said after a long pause. "What I did to you. To other people. It never occurred to me how much it might hurt." Ethan nodded, his chest tight. "It's not just about me," he said. "It's about everyone who's ever felt like they didn't matter. Like they were invisible." Chloe's gaze dropped to the table, her hands stilling. "I didn't mean to be that person," she said softly, "but I guess I was." They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the cafeteria fading into the background. When Chloe finally looked up, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, regret, maybe, or a tentative hope. "What happens now?" she asked. Ethan shrugged. "That's up to you. Blank. Underscore. Blank." Later, as Ethan and Isabel walked home together, he told her about the conversation. Isabel listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think she'll change?" Ethan asked. Isabel smiled faintly. "Maybe, but even if she doesn't, you've done your part. The rest is on her." Ethan nodded, her words settling over him like a balm. For the first time in a long while, he felt lighter, as though the weight he had been carrying had finally begun to lift. Change, he realized, wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations. It was about the small, quiet steps we took every day to be better for ourselves and for each other. The days grew longer as spring settled over the town, the air carrying the faint scent of blossoms and fresh rain. At school, life moved on, as it always did, the events of prom fading into the background of new gossip and upcoming exams. For Ethan Carter, the change was subtle but significant. He no longer felt the weight of every stare or the sting of every whispered word. He was still noticed, but now it was different, less ridicule, more curiosity. It wasn't exactly acceptance, but it was a start. Chloe Brighton, too, had changed, though not in a way that anyone expected. She had grown quieter, her once dominant presence in the hallways replaced by a subdued demeanor. She spent most of her time alone, her friends having distanced themselves in the wake of her fall from grace. But she didn't seem bitter or angry, just reflective, as though she were beginning to understand the fragility of the pedestal she had once stood on. Ethan noticed the change but didn't dwell on it. He was learning to focus on his own path, one step at a time. Blank. Underscore. Blank. One afternoon, Isabel Harper invited Ethan to her house for the first time. It was a small, modest home on the edge of town, its walls lined with shelves of books and photographs. Isabel's mother greeted Ethan warmly, her hands rough from years of work but her smile kind. Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he remembered how the Brightons had treated her. "Make yourself comfortable," Mrs. Harper said, bustling into the kitchen. "Dinner will be ready soon." Ethan looked around the living room, his eyes lingering on a framed photo of Isabel as a little girl, her hand clutching her mother's tightly. The warmth of the home was palpable, a quiet contrast to the cold opulence of the Brightons' house. "This is nice," Ethan said, turning to Isabel. "It feels real." Isabel smiled, a soft, knowing expression. "It is. We don't have much, but it's enough." They sat together on the worn sofa, the silence between them comfortable. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a sense of peace, not the fleeting kind, but the deep, steady kind that comes from being seen and accepted for who you are. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The following week, Chloe approached Ethan during lunch. It was a moment he hadn't anticipated. Her presence at his table both surprising and strangely calm. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan exchanged a glance with Isabel, who gave him a small nod. He followed Chloe to an empty bench outside, the soft rustle of leaves filling the space between them. "I wanted to say thank you," Chloe began, her gaze fixed on the ground. "For talking to me. For giving me a chance to see things differently." Ethan said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she admitted, "about how I made people feel. And you're right, I didn't see it before. But I do now. At least, I'm trying to." Her honesty surprised Ethan. There was no trace of the defensive, arrogant Chloe he had once known. She seemed smaller now, not in stature, but in the way she carried herself, as though the weight of her actions had humbled her. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said after a pause. "But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Ethan nodded slowly. "It's not about forgiveness," he said. "It's about what you do next." Chloe looked up at him then, her eyes searching his. "I'm trying," she said softly. "I really am." For the first time, Ethan believed her. Blank. Underscore. Blank. By the end of the school year, things had settled into a new rhythm. Chloe had started volunteering at the community center, working quietly with children who looked up to her in a way that surprised her. Isabel had received a scholarship to a prestigious college, her hard work and quiet resilience finally paying off. And Ethan, for the first time in years, felt like he was finding his Placino in the shadows. But in the light, the three of them crossed paths occasionally, their interactions polite but distant. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no grand gestures of redemption. Life simply moved forward, as it always did, leaving space for growth and quiet change. Blank. Underscore. Blank. On a warm summer evening, Ethan found himself back under the old oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Isabel joined him, her presence as steady as ever. "Do you think we made a difference?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. Isabel tilted her head, considering the question. "Maybe, but sometimes, it's not about making a difference for the world. Sometimes, it's just about making a difference for yourself." Ethan smiled, her words settling over him like the fading light of the day. They sat together in silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and amber. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real, and for Ethan Carter, that was enough.